Hi everyone, my name is Eduardo. I work as a freelance front-end. I'm also part of the Vue.js core team, and my main focus is the Vue router, which is exactly what I'm going to talk about today. Apart from that, I live in Paris. I also organize a Vue.js Paris meetup, even though we haven't organized anything since 2020. Probably maybe one thing, but hasn't been able to do anything. But if you are around, maybe in 2021, just hit me up if you want to talk or anything. And so I've been spending a lot of the time, like more than a year, doing the rewrite of the Vue router. And the reason behind this is because I've been thinking and experimenting a lot with all the different concepts, all different sections that build up a router, and understanding why something should be in one place or in another. So inside of the router, I've already done some talks about it, so I'm not going to explain how the router works inside, but you have this URL that goes through a history module that talks to the router, and the router is also going to communicate with a matcher that is going to recognize the URL and be able to assign them to the route components that you define, and then the router is going to pass that to the components, which are router link and router view, and then you get access to all that information in your Vue application. But the whole talk is not going to be about this architecture, even though I will refer to it in a few spots, but it's rather about what's new in Vue Router 4, what do you have to change in your application, and to give you an overview of what is exciting, what I'm excited about in this new version, and hopefully also make you excited about it and want to contribute to the router as well. So the first thing that we're going to notice is how things have changed in regard to the way we create the router, we initialize the router, and we pass it to the application. So in Vue Router 3, which I know can be confusing, but it's for Vue 2, and the same happened with Vuex. We have a different version. We had to import this router from Vue Router, and so it's class, and we do new router, and we have a mode that is a string, and we have the array of routes. And then we have to call Vue use router, and then we pass the router instance to the root Vue instance. A lot of instance word around. It's simplified a little bit in the new version. In the new version, what we have is to import these different functions from Vue router. So the whole Vue router library is composed of named export now. This is for tree shaking, of course. And you have this great router that creates an instance router. And instead of having mode, we have the history. And we're going to pass different history versions. So for example, if we are on the server, we're going to call create memory history that creates a version of the history that is not connected to a URL. And then the routes array is not going to change much. We're going to see that in a moment. And finally, we only have to call app.use router. We don't have to pass it anymore to any other option. So the advantages of these is that we have a tree shakeable Vue router, which is lighter, and we have the custom history implementations that can happen. So this is nice for mobile platforms. They can implement stack-based histories and other things. Now, talking about the routes, there are a few changes to note. Most of the things are going to still be the same. We have the same syntax. We have the params with a colon, but for example, we no longer have the star routes, the catch-all routes. Instead, we have to define them through a custom regex. So you see that colon path match with the dot star. That's a custom regex saying we can match absolutely anything. And then the star at the end allows you to repeat that, so you can have multiple segments without encoding the slash inside of that parameter. It's just to make it work better. The good thing is, of course, this is documented. That's part of the migration guide. But coming back to this path mechanism, we no longer use path to regex. So that was a library that was used to transform the path strings into regular expressions, so we can extract different sections of the URL, which allows us to reduce the size. But we also can apply new things. So for example, ordering the routes do not matter anymore. So we could put the path match at the beginning, or you could put movie slash clone ID before a movie slash new, like a static section, so this segment of the URL, and it will still work. Now the order doesn't matter anymore. The router is smarter about it. We still have the strict and sensitive options that we used to have with path regex. I'm just not gonna go into the details of that. So all these part that we're looking at is located at the matcher, and I want to go a little bit above how does this work and give you a short explanation, shorter version of the explanation of how these work. So we transform the path into these kind of regex. So if you're not familiar with regex, this is going to look like another language to you, but I mean, it's a language, but it does everything make sense. You have these parentheses in some places that allows us to capture specific parts of the URL. So for example, you have movies ID, the second one, and then you have a regex that says, I will match anything that is not a slash. And then you have another one with a custom regex that is \d+, which means we want to match any numbers. So we will only match if we have numbers. We won't match if we have anything but a slash. The problem with this is that before, the order used to matter. So if we added a movies new after adding movies ID, we'll be in a problem, because if we want to go to movies new, the router is going to test them in order. So it's going to go, so first one is going to check the regex and say this doesn't work. Then it's going to go to the next one with the ID, and it says, oh, this one works because, well, it works with new matches the regex and the ID will be new. But the one we wanted, it was the last one. So this is a bit confusing when we don't know about the order. And my idea is that order shouldn't matter for the user. You should be able to handle it without needing to know this. So how do we solve this? We solve this by assigning a kind of score to the route, so we can then sort them in a different order that is more pertinent, and that allows us to kind of guess what the user is trying to match against, so that we can test them in order. I'm not going to go into the details of how exactly the scoring works in Vue.router, because it's a bit more complicated than that, because we support subsegments, so you can have multiple parameters between two slashes. So it's not just one number, it's like an array of arrays of numbers. It's a bit more complicated, but to give you an idea is we have a static segment like home, that's going to be 70 points. If we have two segments that are static, like movies and new, that's 70 plus 70, so that's 140. If we have a param that's 60 points instead of 70, and if we have a param with a custom regular expression, we want to add a bonus of 5 points, something like that. But what is the cool thing about this? The cool thing about this is that thanks to all these scoring that allows us to match them in order, we can finally achieve the actual dynamic routing that we didn't have in Vue.router 3. So in Vue.router 3, we have this dynamic routing that is only partial. We only have one function that can add multiple routes at the same time. So it takes this array of routes. But the problem is that, well, if you add them in the wrong order, you find yourself in the same problem we were talking about. You will never be able to actually match the movies new. In the new version of Vue.router, in Vue.router 4, we have a different set of functions. We have add route that allows you to add a new route, remove route that allows you to remove a route by its name, has route that allows you to check if a route exists based on a name. By the way, they can also be symbols. And then you have a get route that allows you to retrieve the whole list of routes. And there is also, it's important to know that add route returns a function that you can call to remove the route as well. So you don't have to rely on having a name or anything. And you can see the content and the full details of these on the RFC. But for now, what I want to talk about is that, well, there is nothing much to talk about dynamic routing. It's just that it's going to work. It's going to enable things like declarative routing. Although it's a bit more complicated than it looks like, because you have to make sure that routes match partially, but the router is prepared for that because you can specify some options. But the good news is that the order doesn't matter anymore. We have plugins that are very easy to do, and I actually love using them when I build my own applications, which is basing your routing on your folder structure, which I think is very intuitive to work with. And we're gonna probably backport the functions to have the same API, but they will still have the caveats that exist. That means that if you add them in the wrong order, well, you're gonna still have a problem. So there is another thing that comes into handy. So we know that the router transforms the URL that you get into an object that you can manipulate much better. So for example, you have the query, you have the params, you have the hash, and they're all divided in small sections. Now, just going over what exactly does this mean, the URL, from the router perspective, you only look at what's after the domain. So you have these three sections: the path, the query, and the hash, also called fragments sometimes. And all of these property can be accessed through the object location that you have globally. I'm not going to go into the details about it, but I want you to look a bit about how we write them and that 20% that you can see them. There is still a question of how do we go from a version that it's natural to us, like a space, or other characters like accents for most languages, or other characters that are not Latin. So how do we go from that space that is readable to us to this non-readable thing that is 20%? So the answer to that is URL encoding. URL encoding may look simple, and it's not that complicated, but it's something that we definitely do not want to take care about. We just want to handle the routing and just pass the things around and hope they are encoded correctly. And most browsers are going to handle these correctly, but some browsers, like things that are not browsers anymore, like Internet Explorer, do not. But you also have things like Safari that are not completely handled correctly. So in its most basic form, if you take a character, for example, the quote, the double quote, the hexadecimal value is 22, so the encoded version is %22. Same for the lower than sign, but if you take the end character from Spanish, the hexadecimal version is F1, but you'll see that encoded, it becomes two things. So that's why I'm saying that the encoding is a bit more complicated, but it's not as if you have to guess. It's not as if you have to read and do a reverse thing. Nobody reads in binary, nobody reads in URL encoded versions. So the whole point is, if you want to write this HTML tag in the URL, you have to write all this nonsense on the URL. And of course, you're going to use functions to have that transformation. But I want you to give a rough idea of what exactly needs to be encoded. And you're going to realize that pretty much everything has to be encoded. If you take into account the whole Unicode set, because you have to encode anything that is not printable. So that goes from 0 to 1F. And also the delete character. You have to encode anything on ASCII, so there you go, pretty much the whole set. And then you have to encode the percentage character, because you need that. We need that to display an encoded version. On top of that, you have an extra few rules for hash, query, and path. So hash, you have the space, the double quote, the lower than and bigger than, and the backtick character that needs to be encoded. Then the path, you have the exact same set, but you also have the hash and the interrogation mark, because they are used later for the query and the hash, so they have to be encoded if you want to use them later. And on the query, you have the exact same as hash, except that you can remove the backtick, it's not needed. And then you have the hash for the same reasons, and the ampersand and the equal, because if you want to use them to separate queries and values. And I forgot to say, but the curly braces on path as well have been reserved just in case for a new syntax. So the point is, if you try to push to location, you're probably never going to write this by hand, but maybe sometimes comes from a variable, and the variable may contain spaces or characters that need to be encoded. So you could also encode it manually. So you could write router push movies and then write the %20 yourself, or encode yourself. But ideally, you will use the version with the params, right? You will pass the param, and then the router will handle the encoding for you. And what I want you to see is that don't do these versions with the strings if they can contain encoded params. Okay, don't do that. You can still do the version where you encode manually if that's easy enough and that's shorter. But the best is to just use a name route and be able to pass the params in a natural language for us, and then the router handles the rest for us. And this also works for query and hash, by the way, on Vue 4. So they are always unencoded, and you can just pass them naturally, and they will be in their natural state as well, the same way you pass them in the route object. So that will be very consistent across browsers. So when we push, we're gonna end up changing the URL, and we're gonna display also. We also have another way to changing the URL is using router links. And you can have multiple different router links. And then what happens is that at the end, we render a nature tag with a class and multiple classes sometimes, depending on the URL we are at. And we have seen a few issues with the current existing behavior for active links in Vue Router. So in Vue Router 4, we are fixing those. We have a improved system for active based on the route records instead of the actual string representation of the URL. So imagine we are in this URL /users24 post, and we can have a router link that goes to the 24 post, and we will have an anchor child with two classes, router link active and router link exact active, because it's exactly the same URL. Whereas the home page we still have the router link active, but it's not really active per se. It shouldn't be, because we're not on the home page. We're not on a nested page of the home page. So the way we had it is if we are on Slack, we're going to apply router link active. If we are using a name route, it's going to also apply the active. And then if we are on a sub part of the URL, like users24, it's also going to be active. And then the only one that is going to be exact active is the exact same URL, 24 post. So the way we handle this in Vue Router 3 is by using the exact prop that basically needs to be always used on the slash. But if we use that, if you use that everywhere, we're gonna break how things work. So it's a bit of a band-aid only for home, which feels weird in a way. And the problem is that if we have something else on the URL, so for example, we have a hash related, well then the URL users24 post will no longer be exactly active, so that won't work for them. So instead what we do is we handle the active mechanism by route records and by the relationship between each other, so the route nesting. So for example, if we are on a route, no matter the hash, no matter the query, we're only going to look at the route records, which only care about the path. But also means that if you have any aliases, they're also going to work seamlessly. So if you are on this URL, you're going to have users24 that's going to be active, and you're going to have users24 post that's going to be exactly active and active. Whereas profile is not going to be either active or exact active because it's an adjacent child to 24 post. And if you're going to go and see the whole details, because there is a lot on this one, there is a few tables that you can look at. There is the RFC that has been merged, and you have the tables with all the details and different cases with aliases, nested versions, etc., like absolute aliases and everything. But the whole idea is that now is based on the record and not on the string representation, which is something that can be created very easily on the userland if you want to, by using starts with or includes, whereas comparing route records is an internal mechanism to the router, and that it's not exposed and it's harder to understand and manage than just basic string matching. So we have these two ways of going to a URL, and usually when you use router link, you don't see any errors on the console, anything that may happen. But if you are using the programmatic API, you may have come across some navigation failures, and more specifically errors and uncaught in promises errors. So it looks like this. You call twice, for example, a push on the same location, and what happens behind the scenes is that the router is going to negate, is going to dismiss that navigation because we're already on the same exact location, so there is no need to go there. The problem is that we always have these kind of abortions of navigations and errors, so to say, but they were passed to callbacks. And with the introduction of the promise API, so router push will return a promise, not catching them will result in errors in the console, which is not exactly what you want, because it's not an error, it's just a navigation that failed, that was rejected. But it can be confusing because you have the error word there. So where does this come from? This comes from the older version of router push that accepted two callbacks, because at the time there were still a lot of browsers that didn't support promises, so it was interesting to support promises and also callbacks. So that happen is that if you use the version without passing a callback, well, you get the uncaught promise. If you use the version with the callbacks, you will then get any error because there is no promise. So the problem comes from these two callbacks. And the thing is, uncomplete will be reflected globally inside an after each. So if a navigation finishes, you get the after each. On the other hand, on abort, which is, for example, what happens when you cancel navigation by calling next false, will have no global equivalent. So there is no way to detect when a navigation finishes, even if it failed or something. So for example, if you want to apply like a loading bar or something somewhere, there is no way for you to globally hook into that process and hide the global loading state on the page. So how do we solve these? Well, now the uncomplete and unabort both go into the resolve version of the route. So we get a failure or a reason for a navigation failure, and that failure can be later on read on after each. If the navigation succeeds, there is no failure. That value is going to be null or undefined. And the catch version, so whenever you have an unexpected error, which is different, it's like a throw of new error and stuff like that, or just a JavaScript error, then that's going to go into the router on error. So you have global versions to handle everything, and you can still hook into the navigation from a global perspective and still know if you finish or not. So the way you handle this is documented, of course, but you have a navigation failure type and this navigation failure function, and you can check if a failure is a navigation failure, which basically is gonna, if you pass no second argument, is gonna just tell you if it's non-null, because you can just check if the failure is non-null, or just check if it's truthy. But you can also check for specific navigation failures, and you have three types. You have a canceled, so that's when you call next false. Abort is when you have a navigation that starts, but there is another one that it started while the other one hasn't finished. And then duplicated is when you push to the exact same location twice. If you're gonna if you want to see the whole details about the VRC, that's the RFC you want to check out. There are a few changes also to scroll behavior that are related to these navigation failures. Is that now the scroll behavior will be more consistent to native behavior. So for example, when you click twice on the same link, you will still scroll and stuff like that because it's still considered a navigation and you still trigger the after each. So it's more consistent in that aspect. But also we have a few things. So for example, we're changing the selector and the offset. We're going to a more flat structure with EL that is going to be either an ID or an element. So that way you have the complete freedom, but the most basic use case is passing a hash, like an ID selector. And it wasn't always working before because you have some characters you need to escape, and it's not the same as escaping the characters in the URLs. That was a bit, it was very easy to miss all the time. So now it's more consistent to work with the most basic use cases while still providing a version by providing an element, a DOM element, so a version that works in any case. And the reason we are changing the offset into a flat structure is to support the scroll to options object that is native and implemented by most browsers. The only one that doesn't support it is Safari. I mean, an Internet Explorer, but doesn't count. And you can provide extra options like behavior smooth, which allows you to just let the browser handle how the smooth looks, the scroll looks, which is really nice. You can also apply it globally on CSS, and it looks something like this. So here's an example where I click on different routes. There are animations, transitions, and you can see how the scroll still goes to the place we were at. I scroll a little bit, go forward, and then I go back and I find myself in the same position. Then I go forward again and scroll a little bit and repeat the process to see how I find myself in the same position I was, even with transitions. And then I'm gonna go to a number, and then going back again, I can see how I still keep the same scroll I was at. And so I'm gonna click on the same link again, and I can see how I scroll again to the same position. It works the same. And now I'm gonna probably activate the smooth scroll. I can see how the browser is natively scrolling to the places, work with transitions, all goes very well. You still have to handle the transitions with a small snippet of code by returning a promise, but it's pretty smooth. If you want to know more about the VStarFC, this is the one you have to look at, the 176. Okay, onto navigation guards. There is a few improvements to navigation guards that are really nice. And the most noticeable one is that now, well, you can still use the same navigation guards you used to with the next, but now we can also return a value instead of calling next. Now, the reason this is very nice is because it allows you to omit the parameters in the guard, and it also prevents some mistakes. And it works, so you can return anything you would pass to next, but you can also use an async await version, so you return a promise. It's just that it's transparent. It's gonna unwrap the promise behind the scenes. And my personal favorite reason to use this version is because it avoids very easy mistakes, which is calling next multiple times, because you can only return once. So that's a very good advantage for me. If you want to know more about the whole navigation guard refactor, which is going to be backported to Vue 3 probably, and it's open for contributions, by the way, you can check this IRC, the 187. Okay, there is a new thing that can also be backported, which is the route prop on router view. Now, I could go and explain the route prop like that, but the truth is it doesn't speak to anybody. So instead, what I'm going to talk is about displaying models, because I know this is going to talk to more people. And I'm going to show you a cut sample where we can use this and how does it work. So the idea is to provide to the router view a different route location, a resolve route that it can display. So instead of displaying the one that is a resolved version of the URL, it displays whatever we want. So we start by retrieving the actual route that, so this is the setup inside of a setup function, by the way, but it can also be done in an option API. You retrieve the route using use route, which is the resolved version of the URL. And then you're gonna use this trick to get a reactive version of the history state. So you use a computer property and then you look at the root full path. So that's gonna trigger the computer every time that the route changes, but I'm gonna return the history state. Full path is never empty, so that's always gonna work. And then we have this piece of code, so we have another compute. It's a route model, and you can see that we're gonna read the history state and see if there is a state property called background view. And if that's the case, we're gonna call the router resolve function to be able to have this resolve version of a string, basically. And otherwise, we return the route, which is the current location that we will have by default if we didn't use the route prop. And then we only need to pass that variable as the route prop. And what we get is something like this, where we can go to the page, it's changed the URL, you can see the URL is users/1, and we can go back and forward, but we can also open models, and it changes the URL, but we stay on the same page. And we can also navigate away, so we can go somewhere else, then go back. We still have the model in the history. We can even reload the page, we go back, we still have the model because it's in the history. You can remove it from the history if you want, it's up to you, but by default, if you do this mechanism, you will have a model that appears all the time, which is pretty neat. So if you want to check more about these, it's a short IRC, but you have these route prop on the router views. And so the new things that are coming also is everything composition API, of course, because we have this new composition API with Vue3. So we have these functions, so you can use the router option API in setup. The two most basic ones are the equivalent of route and router. So on Vue 4, you still have access to these $route and these $router in components and in templates. But if you're inside of a setup function, you're going to have to use the use router and use route. So the route, it's a reactive object, so you can just use it directly. It's kind of like the props. You can also transform it to refs if you want and just extract the things that you want and pass them around to other functions. But by default, you have a reactive object, so you don't have to do route.value something. You can just do route.params.id. It's unwrapped automatically. And the router is just the instance of the router. There is nothing, there is no ref, no compute, or any magic to look at that. And then you have the navigation guides. We have only two of them. We have on before route leave and on before route update. We might add some in the future, but you might be wondering why there is no on before route enter. And the reason is very simple, is because the before route enter happens before the component is mounted, so before setup is executed. So we cannot have a hook that we wouldn't have a way to get that hook before actually mounting the component. It doesn't mean that it's completely impossible. There are ways to achieve it, but it's not that easy of an API as you might imagine. So we have by default only these two versions that are nice, which is on before route leave and on before route update. And the good thing about these two versions is that you can use them also in components that are nested inside route components, which is not the case for the option API, where you can only use them on the route components themselves. So that's pretty neat. About the router-link, we now also have a version, a composition API called useLink that allows you to pass a ref, a computed, or just a raw props object of to replace and any other prop that can be passed to router-link, and it gives you everything you get already access to through the vslot API. So this is for you to create custom versions of router-link that are more adapted to your application, or maybe to use the isActive or isExactActive behavior, just to give you some flexibility. All these properties are reactive, so I mean there are computed properties, isActive, isExactActive, href, etc., etc. And last but not least, we can talk a little bit about Devtools. So I guess Guillaume will be talking about what he's bringing to the Devtools, but it's pretty exciting. In a matter of a few hours, maybe an hour, got a very nice, already very useful version of the Devtools for the Vue router. I don't have to live anymore within the Vue Devtools. It's added by the libraries. So if you are a library author, this is going to be very cool for you. And this is an old version that I'm showing right now, but basically you can match the routes right into when you see the filter routes, you can actually write /users/to, and it's going to show you the routes that it matches. It can also match by name, by partial things, so you can search routes in different ways and see maybe why something isn't working, why you're not displaying the view that you wanted to display. So that's pretty neat. There is also a version that I'm not showing here. It's the timeline, so you can see all the navigations that happened by the router. You can see the errors, the navigation that didn't finish or that were rejected. You can also see all those details, where you were coming from, where you were going to, etc. I'm also planning on maybe be able to change the routes on the fly directly on this panel, but that will be probably for later after the release. And so to summarize, we have these are the most demanded features. There was the dynamic routing. Custom history is a bit special, better encoding defaults, so not having to deal with double encoding problems and things that were not consistent across browsers. The composition API was a must. We have better navigation guides, and we're probably going to backport that to Vue3. We have a much better type string support. For example, you can now type the meta property of the meta fields of the routes, and this is going to be backported as well. And I think it's easier to contribute because how things are architecture now. So I really invite you to, I'm very active on the repository, so I usually reply very quickly to anything that happened, and I've helped already some folks to get some contributions landed. And so it's going to be much better debugging, I can tell you that. I'm planning on adding some videos for visual learners, so you can follow the documentation in a more in a video version basically, and also more specific scenarios and problems I can see with people and expose them in different formats for later. And last but not least, the current Vue router version is about 9 kilobytes because we do have a lot of features that you don't find in other routers, and the new version is under 7 kilobytes. It's not even 6.9, it's a bit lower than that, but we're under the 7 kilobyte bar, and we still have a lot of things that, I mean, we have more things than before, and we are still lighter. If you want to check more, well, the repository is Vue router next, and I just want to say, well, if you enjoy what I do, please check out my GitHub sponsors. I will be providing very soon content that is specific to the router, and I will be giving it only 2 sponsors that are a specific tier. And I also want to thank my sponsors that are helping me to keep my open source work sustainable. Thank you, everyone.